Welcome back, everybody. During the COVID-19 pandemic, public health officials have urged us to wash our hands more, not to touch our faces, keep everything clean and sanitized. But for people struggling with obsessive compulsive disorder, these guidelines can be tricky and triggering. Joining us now to further our conversations on mental health and to help us understand OCD and the impact of the pandemic is clinical psychologist Jenny Rogojanski. Hello, Jenny. Nice to meet you, and thank you for being on our show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on to talk about this important topic.
I think that when most people think of obsessive compulsive disorder, they imagine someone who meticulously lines up everything in their cupboards or their refrigerators, but it's a little bit more complex and nuanced than that. So let's start by understanding exactly what OCD is.
So obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, is a psychological condition that affects all people of all ages and from all walks of life. And it's characterized by the presence of obsessions or compulsions. The obsessions are distressing, intrusive thoughts, images, or impulses that trigger a lot of anxiety for people, and they really can be about absolutely anything. So while it is true that a lot of times people think about OCD as involving people lining things up or having things in a perfect state of order, the reality is that any thought that's intrusive and upsetting but keeps coming back into the person's mind, despite them not wanting the thought to, can be considered an obsession. So for example, people who have OCD might feel like they can't stop thinking about things such as harming themselves or someone else, even though they don't actually want to do those things, or being contaminated with germs, or having fear of certain numbers or words or other superstitious beliefs. Or they might be preoccupied with things such as illness or symptoms that they're having. Compulsions or rituals, on the other hand, are the behaviors that people engage in order to get rid of their obsessions or reduce the distress associated with those obsessions. So, for example, it can be things such as washing or cleaning too much, or repeating a certain word or phrase in your mind, or doing it until you feel better or undo a particular harm. It can include checking and rechecking things like the locks or appliances, or things like counting objects or counting in certain sets of numbers.
And how do you recognize it in yourself or someone you love?
That's a great question, Jess. You really can come to recognize that you might be having OCD when you're having thoughts or you're engaging in rituals that don't really make any sense to you, and yet you can't stop yourself from engaging in them. While most people have some obsessive thoughts or may engage in some compulsive behaviors from time to time, OCD is diagnosed when this cycle of obsessions and compulsions becomes so extreme that it's really consuming a lot of time or getting in the way of people doing other important activities that they value.
Jenny, where the pandemic is concerned, though, it's very real. There is community transmission, in some places very high. So we're all more concerned about germs and contamination. What is the difference then between overly cautious and obsessive compulsive?
Yeah, Lainey, you're right. I think the pandemic has definitely created a lot of stress for all of us, with or without OCD. And most people in the general population are engaging in a lot more behaviors that we might associate with OCD, like more frequent hand washing or cleaning. And this is probably a good thing, as you were saying, because we are living through a pandemic. However, for people with OCD, these behaviors can really take on a life of their own. And the cycle of obsessions and compulsions can get so extreme that it becomes incredibly time consuming and can really start to interfere with day-to-day life. And so this is probably the biggest difference between someone being overly cautious versus actually struggling with OCD. Someone who's cautious is going to be vigilant and they're going to follow guidelines in order to reduce the spread of the virus. But somebody with OCD is likely going to go above and beyond those guidelines, and they're going to feel the need to maybe repeat certain steps or actions because they don't feel complete or sufficient.
Were you concerned about your patients and how they would adapt to these new guidelines?
Yeah, initially I was quite concerned about some of my patients with OCD because when the pandemic first hit, we were suddenly bombarded with so much information about this virus and all the things that we needed to do to change our behavior in order to stop the spread. And a lot of these recommendations actually directly contradicted the work that we were doing in therapy around exposures.
Oh.
And so I was extremely happy to see how resilient a lot of my patients with OCD were in the face of the pandemic, which really makes sense when you think about the fact that treatment of OCD is all about helping people feel more comfortable and be able to tolerate their doubt and uncertainty. And so in some ways, I think my patients were better prepared for dealing with this pandemic than were other people who were not actively working on this. That being said, though, obviously, individuals with OCD who may not be in treatment were likely impacted significantly more than others by the pandemic because we know that OCD really thrives when people feel doubt and uncertainty. And so they engage in all these compulsive behaviors in order to feel more certain. And so, as you can imagine, the pandemic can be particularly challenging for people with OCD because now on top of their normal feelings of uncertainty, they're actually getting these legitimate messages from health researchers and government bodies that the world is not safe and they should be doing these various behaviors in order to increase their safety. And so that would really feed the OCD.
Jenny, I already have some compulsions. I'm very schedule focused, and it's become more so during the pandemic. In fact, I have had problems when, for various reasons, things go off schedule. I have a very hard time dealing with it. I also still shower 3 times a day, sometimes more, even though I don't go anywhere. I don't leave my house. My parents are also, they have lots of phobias. So my question is, will this current environment that we're all living in increase the risk of developing compulsions around cleanliness or safety post-pandemic?
Lainey, you're not alone in that. And I do think that there is going to be this period of readjustment post-pandemic for everybody. And there might be some behaviors that some of us hold on to even when all of this is behind us. However, we know that research shows that genetics really plays a large role in the development of OCD, and that life stress may play a role in activating the genes that are associated with the symptoms of OCD. So it's possible that those who are predisposed towards OCD may start to manifest some of those symptoms of the disorder now, given that we are all living through this really incredibly stressful time.
And if there is someone who is currently struggling with OCD, especially during these stressful times, is there something that they can do?
Well, my first tip would be to limit how much time you're spending reading about or watching news related to COVID-19. I usually recommend for everybody, but particularly for people who are struggling with OCD, to set a daily limit of 5 minutes once per day to look at news sources and updates, and to really try to stick to trusted local sources of information. Stick to the recommendations that are set out by trusted government and health organizations. But as I mentioned earlier, to really try not to go above and beyond those recommendations, even if that does not feel like enough. If you're not in treatment, I really encourage you to consider getting support from a professional who is well trained in evidence-based treatments for OCD, such as ERP. And a great resource for this is the International OCD Foundation. And the most important thing to know is that you're not alone. There are excellent treatments out there that can help, so definitely reach out for support.
Jenny, this has been so interesting. Thank you for sharing this important information with us today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back.